Queen Mary has had a really long heritage and history of supporting the East London communities.
We have a strong reformer heritage from our founding institutions, and as one example of that, the People's Palace, which has subsequently grown into our Mile End campus. It was all around service to East London and East Londoners.
So the role of institutions, as far as civil society institutions, is really, really critical for healthy democracy. I think universities also have a special place as a civic institution, a public institution, and how that plays out locally. I think that's really critical.
For many years and decades, our staff and students have been engaging communities across East London, both with their research, our teaching and education, but also in terms of extracurricular activity like student volunteering.
Civic work is really crucial to Queen Mary. We work with partners and other stakeholders from a wide range of different sectors. We work with businesses and local authorities. We work with the health, education and cultural sectors, and we work really closely with community organisations.
For me, civic means public. Public means anyone can come. By having a civic university agreement, you are actually taking responsibility for what happens locally. And I think there's a special kind of magic about being from East London and having that identity.
Queen Mary took a really co-produced approach to forming its civic agreement. We worked with different partners locally on a big listening campaign across East London, which listened to various stakeholders, residents, organisations across the 7 East London boroughs, which really helped capture what the role of a university should be in East London, and particularly the role of what Queen Mary could and should be doing more in its place.
The 5 themes in our Civic University Agreement are focused on inclusive placemaking, healthy and sustainable futures, pathways for life, and Queen Mary as a cultural hub for East London. And the 5th one, which really underpins everything in our civic work, is around enabling civic practice.
The opportunity to be part of the Civic Advisory Board at Queen Mary is a perfect example of what a strategic partnership would look like. There is a richness in that relationship because of the knowledge exchange. We get to learn so much from not just Queen Mary but other partners as well.
We actually have a portfolio of degree apprenticeships. The ones that are run out of the building that we're in now are mainly around digital skills. Most companies really today are looking for people who have digital skills because it's so important to just about every form of business.
I think the kind of future-proofing of jobs is really important because a kid in school down the road here needs to know that they have a choice to stay here and work here if they want to.
So one of the things that we've actually done over the last few years is we've established the Queen Mary Enterprise Zone. So this is space where micro businesses can have rental, hot desking type space or more established space. And that allows them to remain local to Queen Mary. It allows them to access the other support that Queen Mary is able to provide.
Queen Mary's really glad to be part of an NIHR-funded programme called the Health Determinants Research Collaboration. We are one of 3 university partners on the Tower Hamlets HDRC, which is led by Tower Hamlets Council, really bringing together a strong partnership to be addressing health inequalities and health equity in Tower Hamlets specifically, but also that's clearly connected with East London more widely and much further beyond. So we're building on strong foundations with our civic work, really looking for the way that we take this forward to meet the priorities of our local area. How can we live in a more sustainable way in the places that we are?